Imagine living in a place where everyone around you has a secret, where every smile hides a story, and every casual conversation could be hiding a truth so dark it could change everything. Marry Me, a quaint village that seems peaceful from the outside, holds a secret deep beneath its calm surface. A secret triggered by a single wrong move, a swapped plate, a poisoned bite. What if one mistake could cost a life? Are you ready to uncover the mystery? Or will you too hide your secrets just a little bit deeper? Come with us as we unravel the dark undercurrents of this village, where every secret waits for its time to surface. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, the warm, honeyed afternoon sun casting long, languid shadows across the village lawn. The air was thick with the fragrance of freshly cut grass, mingling faintly with lavender, as if nature itself was pausing to inhale. It was the kind of day that seemed ripped straight from a picture postcard, peaceful, serene and innocent. Or at least it appeared that way to the casual observer. The guests of St. Mary Mead, the ladies of the village society, moved gracefully between tables, their laughter like soft ripples in a pond, accompanied by the rhythmic clinking of teacups and the rustle of skirts brushing the dewy grass. The annual garden tea was more than just a gathering of old friends and neighbors. It was a stage where social rivalries and undercurrents of gossip played out like a fine-tuned performance. Conversations meandered between superficial pleasantries about floral arrangements and scone recipes, but behind every exchange lay sharp judgments about dress hems, the texture of pastries, and the private failings of husbands. To the untrained eye, Miss Marple was simply another elderly lady, contentedly knitting as she watched the world go by. Yet to anyone who truly knew her, she was anything but an idle observer. Her keen eyes missed nothing, and her mind sifted through the fragments of conversation that danced on the breeze like autumn leaves. In St. Mary Mead, gossip wasn't just talk, it was currency, traded with precision and care, and today the air was rich with it. At the heart of the refreshments table stood a plum cake, its dark surface glistening beneath a careful dusting of sugar, an elegant display of Mrs. Lathbury's celebrated baking skills. The women, as they complimented her, seemed almost distracted, their words lacking the usual warmth, as if something unseen hung in the air. It wasn't just the cake that commanded attention, it was the man standing at the periphery of the gathering, Mr. Godfrey. His posture was uncertain, as though he was trying to fit into a place he no longer belonged, his eyes darting about, taking in the scene like a man returning to a place full of memories, some perhaps better left forgotten. He had been gone for over 20 years, after an infamous dispute over a family inheritance that had caused more than its share of gossip. No one quite knew what had happened, but the whispers about money gone missing, and the quarrel that had escalated into something far uglier, still lingered. And now here he was, his presence casting a shadow over the tea party, his gaze lingering a little too long on the plum cake, his lips twisted in a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Miss Marple's knitting paused as she watched him, her attention sharpening. She noticed the way his eyes flickered towards the cake, as if something about it had unsettled him. The slightest, almost imperceptible change in the atmosphere was enough to make her instincts prick up. As the afternoon wore on, the gentle chatter among the ladies shifted, their voices dipping to a hushed murmur, the kind that signaled the presence of something more ominous beneath the surface. "Did you hear?" Mrs. Bantry whispered, her eyes narrowing as she glanced in Mr. Godfrey's direction. "He's back to settle something unfinished business with the old cottage his aunt left him, or so they say. But I heard it's not just the cottage he's after." "The nerve," her companion responded, eyes darting around the table, her voice laced with judgment. "After everything. And poor Mrs. Lathbury, serving him that cake. Can you imagine?" Miss Marple's lips curled into a faint knowing smile, but her eyes remained focused, capturing every detail, every word. In St. Mary Mead, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The plum cake, that simple innocent confection, was no longer just a display of culinary prowess. It had become something more, something darker. Miss Marple's gaze fixed on the cake's edge, where the sugar dusting had been smudged slightly, as though a finger had traced its outline before it had been set out for the guests. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, yet to her it spoke volumes. As the afternoon drifted toward evening, the layers of tension in the air grew thicker. Mr. Godfrey's eyes never fully left the cake, his expression hardening with every passing moment, and Mrs. Lathbury, for all her brisk exterior, was becoming increasingly uneasy. She smiled and accepted compliments, but her gaze kept darting toward Mr. Godfrey, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps dread, flashing in her eyes. Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly, piecing together the puzzle. There was more to this cake, more to this man's return, than anyone had yet realized. This was no longer just a village gathering. It was the setting for something much deeper, much more dangerous. The afternoon had begun with the simplicity of a tea party, but now it was the calm before a storm. It was the kind of afternoon that seemed plucked straight from a picture postcard. Golden sunlight spilling like liquid gold through the towering yew trees, the sweet scent of freshly cut grass and lavender blending in the air, and the gentle hum of quiet chatter drifting on the breeze. Behind the vicarage, the lawn had been transformed into a haven for the village's elite, tables draped in crisp white cloths, and laden with delicate sandwiches and cups of tea. The ladies of St. Mary Mead flitted between them like butterflies, balancing plates with practiced grace, laughter occasionally punctuated by the soft clink of china, and the rustle of skirts. The annual garden party wasn't just a social gathering. It was a stage where rivalries simmered, friendships were tested, and secrets long buried came to the surface. This year, as in all others, the competition was fierce. Flowers, scones and the occasional whispered judgment about Hem's husbands, and the hidden flaws of each of the village's esteemed matrons. Miss Marple, however, sat somewhat apart from it all, comfortably nestled in the shade near the rose border, her knitting forgotten in her lap. To the casual observer, she was just a sweet elderly lady, enjoying a quiet afternoon with a slice of lemon drizzle cake. But those who knew her well would notice the small, almost imperceptible way her eyes flitted from conversation to conversation, observing, listening, catching the whispers that filled the air like smoke. In St. Mary Mead, gossip was more than idle chatter. It was a currency, traded and passed with precision. Today that currency was rich, laced with the return of a long-forgotten figure, Mr. Godfrey, a man whose name was whispered with the kind of tension that could only come from years of unresolved conflict. He stood at the edge of the gathering, a man out of place in both the time and the company. His once pristine suit was frayed at the cuffs, his shoes scuffed, and his demeanor, a mix of wariness and regret, suggested a man who had returned home not for a warm welcome, but with some unfinished business. The whispers began almost immediately. Something about a dispute over inheritance, an old cottage that had been left to him by his aunt, and a bitter falling out that had driven him away 20 years ago. But it was the cake, the plum cake, that held everyone's attention. A masterpiece baked by Mrs. Lathbury, whose pastries were the envy of the village. Her cakes had always drawn praise, yet this year, something was different. The compliments felt perfunctory, as if the guests were distracted, their minds elsewhere. And perhaps they were, for the real conversation swirled not around roses or biscuits, but around the man standing just out of reach of the crowd. Miss Marple watched him closely, her fingers still on the knitting that had long ceased to serve its purpose. She saw it before anyone else, a small, almost unnoticeable smudge along the edge of the plum cake, where the dusting of sugar had been disturbed, as though a finger had traced it before the cake had been set out. It was nothing, and yet it was everything. Her senses sharpened. Something wasn't right. The tea continued, the gossip deepening like the shadows cast by the sinking sun, when suddenly the air shifted. Mrs. Emmeline Hartnell, one of the village's more gossipy residents, had just taken a bite of the cake, and at first, everything seemed normal. But then came the cough, a harsh, ragged sound that drew everyone's gaze. Her face turned ashen, her breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. She staggered, dropping her plate as her body lurched forward. The plum cake, now stained with the chaos of the moment, lay in ruin at her feet. The garden erupted into confusion. People rushed to help, but amid the panic, Miss Marple remained still, her eyes never leaving the scene. The village doctor, who had been attending to a cucumber competition nearby, was the first to reach Mrs. Hartnell. His movements were swift, efficient, the mark of someone who had seen his share of emergencies. Yet, when he muttered the word poison, a cold shiver ran through the crowd. Cyanide. Miss Marple's gaze hardened. This was no accident. Cyanide wasn't a poison one stumbled upon, it was chosen. And this, Miss Marple knew, was no random act, it was deliberate. The whispers began again, but this time, they were edged with suspicion. Who would do such a thing? And more pressing, why? The suspicion hung thick in the air, as everyone began to look at each other differently, as if the shadows of the past had suddenly become real, and the returning Mr. Godfrey was at the heart of it. The warm hum of the garden party had barely faded when the atmosphere shifted, a subtle change rippling through the gathering, like an unexpected chill. Miss Marple, as ever, was the keen observer, watching not just the guests but the nuances of every passing moment. Mrs. Lorry, a picture of quiet pride, had just passed around her homemade plum cake, each slice served with an almost ritualistic precision. Yet, there was something that lingered in the air, an unspoken tension that no one seemed to address directly. As the cake was consumed, whispers began to weave their way between the guests, suspicions taking root in quiet corners. Hartnell, usually the center of every conversation, had always possessed a knack for stirring trouble, but who would have imagined that she would find herself on the receiving end of something far darker? Her coughing fit had been alarming, sharp and unexpected, her face drained of color as she collapsed, her fragile form shaking as the cake, now ruined, lay in shards around her. The once festive gathering had devolved into chaos, with every face frozen in shock, and every voice rising in confusion. Yet, amidst the hysteria, one figure remained unnervingly still. Miss Marple. Her knitting, once poised delicately in her hands, was now forgotten, as she studied the scene with the sharp, calculating eye that had seen more than most would ever understand. She was acutely aware of the doctor's grim muttering, the whispered word that could not have been more damning. Poison. Cyanide. A deliberate choice, the kind of poison that demanded careful thought and malice. The garden, once alive with laughter, now buzzed with the scent of fear and the weight of suspicion. The questions began almost immediately. Who among them had the motive? Was it Mrs. Lorry, who might have slipped something sinister into the cake, her bitterness over past slights with Mrs. Hartnell now playing out in the most deadly of ways? Or Mrs. Bantry, the hostess whose kitchen had been the scene of the crime, a woman with more secrets than any village gathering could ever hope to contain? Perhaps it was Mr. Godfrey, the long-lost son returned to St. Mary Mead after years of absence, his sudden reappearance stirring old grievances that never quite healed. Names were muttered, but Miss Marple remained silent, observing as the pieces began to fall into place. She was no stranger to village gossip, but she knew better than to rely on the whispers of others. It was always the quiet ones, the ones who did not rush to conclusions, who noticed what others missed. That's when she saw it, the faintest flicker of relief on the face of one guest, a woman who had stood apart from the crowd, her expression an odd blend of shock and something far more troubling. Relief, not grief. In that moment, Miss Marple's mind began to race, a single thought forming clearly in the chaos of the moment. If the wrong person had died, then the right person might still be very much alive. The next day, as she made her rounds in the village, paying those customary visits, Miss Marple spoke little, her inquiries soft, measured. Mrs. Bantry, though clearly disturbed, was quick to offer up her theories, hinting at old rivalries and long-forgotten grudges. She dropped the name of Mr. Godfrey, with a casualness that betrayed her knowledge of something deeper, something only the oldest villagers seemed to remember. Yet, it was Miss Marple's quiet acknowledgement that turned the conversation, her gentle prod that revealed just enough to keep the thread of suspicion spinning. The truth, she knew, was hidden in the most unlikely of places, between the words that were left unsaid, and the reactions that didn't quite match the tragedy at hand. As she left Mrs. Bantry's home, her mind was already a few steps ahead, the delicate tapestry of village secrets slowly unraveling before her. Miss Marple's daily visits had become a quiet procession through the village, each one adding layers to a story that no one yet seemed willing to piece together. At Mrs. Price Ridley's, the air had been thick with talk of inheritance disputes, petty squabbles that had poisoned a family's bond decades ago, leaving only bitterness in their wake. The conversation, while seemingly harmless, hinted at something darker, a festering resentment that still simmered beneath the surface of the village. Mrs. Ridley had mentioned an old cousin's fortune, now tied up in legal battles, and how certain names whispered in the past had somehow resurfaced in the present. It was only after Miss Marple had made her polite exit, thanking her for the tea, that she realized the family secrets didn't just remain confined to the old papers. They lived, breathing and alive, in the whispered conversations of the people who carried them forward. At Miss Weatherby's, the talk turned to a romance gone awry, a young woman jilted at the altar, her heartbroken innocence now hardened into a razor-sharp cynicism. The sadness of the story was palpable, but it was the bitterness of the woman who had lived through it that resonated more deeply with Miss Marple. The village knew little of the full extent of the wound, but the scars were there, hidden in the dark corners of the town's gossip. No one mentioned the woman's name directly, but Miss Marple caught the subtle references, the knowing glances. By the time she made her way to Colonel Easterbrook's house, the tone had shifted once more, this time to something darker still. The colonel, his stern face softened by the years, but still holding a commanding presence, stirred his tea with unnecessary vigor, his voice dropping into the kind of low conspiratorial pitch that made others lean in. "You know," he said, his eyes narrowing as if he could see the past unfolding right in front of him. "People forget, but I remember quite clearly." The colonel paused, his gaze fixed on the far wall, as if he could still see the old shadows lingering there. There were rumors about money meant for a poor girl, vanishing, disappearing, like it never existed. Nobody really knew what had happened, but we all knew there was something ugly about it, something no one wanted to talk about. Miss Marple listened carefully, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face the picture of polite interest. She didn't press, didn't ask for details. Instead, she simply let the conversation unravel itself. By the time she left, her knitting bag was heavier than when she'd arrived, not from the yarn, but from the little scraps of stories, the half-finished pieces of a puzzle that only she seemed to see. Each house, each conversation, had given her more than the villagers themselves realized. But she was patient, content to wait for the right moment to pull them all together. When she finally reached Mrs. Bartlett's parlor, the conversation had shifted yet again. No longer were they gossiping about cake recipes, or the peculiarities of Mrs. Hartnell's life. The talk had turned to a newcomer, Mr. Timpson, who had moved into the old station master's cottage. He was a man of few words, and his silence had already stirred suspicion among the villagers, who were only too eager to find fault in someone new. Mrs. Bartlett, with a gleam of delight in her eyes, leaned in and lowered her voice, eager to share what she knew. "He's been in trouble before," she whispered, looking over her shoulder as if to ensure no one else could overhear. "Something to do with forgery, or maybe theft. It's hard to remember exactly. But you know the saying, once a thief, always a thief." Miss Marple didn't respond immediately, but the words sat heavily in her mind. She had seen this pattern before, how the village would find the easiest target and build their suspicions around him until he became the villain in their story. She didn't buy into it. She never did. It was too easy, too convenient. And Miss Marple knew well that convenience was often a mask for deeper truths, truths people didn't want to face. As she walked down the lane, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The village had accepted Mr. Timpson's guilt too quickly, too effortlessly. She wasn't convinced. There was more to this, something deeper and darker than a newcomer's troubled past. Miss Marple thought back to the missing recipe book, to the strange tension at the garden party when Mrs. Hartnell had died, and the way the villagers had reacted. They had expected a death, but not hers. No, Miss Marple's instincts told her that the wrong person had died. The right person, the one who should have been in that coffin, was still out there, hiding behind a veil of innocence, afraid of being exposed. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Constable Gregg the following morning. His face flushed with embarrassment as he approached the vicarage. He stood awkwardly, shifting from one foot to the other, his notebook in hand, as though the very notion of poisoning at a garden party was somehow beneath him. "Cyanide," he said, almost apologetically, as if the words themselves were too dark to utter in polite company. "That's the official word from Dr. Hugh." A collective murmur rippled through the room, a mixture of surprise, disbelief, and for some, a sense of reluctant satisfaction. The news had spread like wildfire through the village, but now, the questions began in earnest. How had someone gained access to cyanide? Who could have been so cold-hearted to poison a person at a party meant for celebration? Mrs. Bantry, always quick to offer her opinion, suggested rat poison with a casual shrug, but Miss Marple, folding napkins with deliberate precision, noticed the slight hesitation in her voice. The way she glanced away, as though she herself didn't want to acknowledge the grim possibility of what she had just said, made Miss Marple's sharp mind whir even faster. It wasn't just the cyanide that troubled her, it was the reaction of the villagers. Some were relieved, others, alarmed. But one thing was clear, everyone was looking in the wrong direction. The loudest voices, the clearest accusations, often hid the quiet truths that no one wanted to hear. And Miss Marple, ever patient, was already piecing those truths together, a few strands at a time. She knew the wrong person had died. She knew that the one truly responsible for the crime was still out there, waiting, watching, and growing more desperate by the day to keep their secrets hidden. Miss Marple sat back in her armchair, the rhythmic click of her knitting needles the only sound in the room, her thoughts moving at a pace far faster than her fingers could work. The village, with all its whispered secrets and veiled truths, had once again served as the backdrop for a crime that seemed to defy simple understanding. The conversation with Constable Gregg earlier had planted a thought in her mind, one that she couldn't shake, even as she pondered the details of the tragedy. There was talk of a chemist, someone with specialist knowledge, another vague clue dropped in a sea of half-formed theories. But Miss Marple knew that phrases like specialist knowledge often mask something deeper, something far more sinister. The constable's notes were filled with the usual details: the poison, the cake, the manner of death. But it wasn't the poison itself that held her attention, it was the way it had been folded into the cake, hidden so seamlessly within the batter, that it had taken an expert to carry out such a task. The women of the village, who prided themselves on their baking, exchanged glances filled with suspicion, their smiles tight, as though they were suddenly aware that one of their own had been privy to a secret knowledge of far greater consequence than the perfect rise of a sponge. Miss Marple's mind raced as she recalled the subtle moment she had witnessed at the party. Mrs. Bantry, reaching for a slice of cake, had hesitated, just for a heartbeat, her hand lingering above the plate before it was taken by Mrs. Hartnell, who had by chance accepted the poisoned piece. A trivial thing, many would say, a moment of politeness in the chaos of a crowded table. But Miss Marple, ever observant, had noted the small significant pause. It had struck her immediately, like a whisper on the wind, that the poison wasn't meant for Mrs. Hartnell at all. No, the victim had been someone else, someone whose plate had been mistakenly exchanged. And in that brief overlooked moment, the fates had shifted, and an unintended death had occurred. The deeper Miss Marple's thoughts swirled, the more she felt the weight of the village's unspoken history press upon her. The old quarrels, the whispered betrayals, the long-forgotten loves and resentments, they all played a role in the tragedy, though none of the villagers seemed to recognize it. The poison, the hesitation, the accidental death, they were but the final, telling act in a long-running play. As she sat alone in her parlor, Miss Marple let the silence settle around her, knitting needles clicking in a steady methodical rhythm, as she pieced together the fragments of a story that had been building for years. The cake was not simply a cake. The poison not merely a deadly ingredient. No. This was a crime born of something far more insidious. Old wounds, festering beneath the surface of polite conversation. A history of secrets and lies that had found a way to resurface in the most unexpected of places. In small villages like this, Miss Marple knew well, the past was never truly buried. It only waited, patient and silent, for the right moment to strike. As the evening wore on, she allowed herself a small, bitter smile. She was not yet ready to reveal what she knew. But one thing was certain. The threads of this story were only beginning to weave together. And when they did, they would lead her to a truth more dangerous than anyone in the village could have ever imagined. This was no random act of malice. This was personal. This was revenge, carefully planned and executed, with a precision that left no room for error. And somewhere, in the shadows of the village, the true victim still walked free, unaware of the storm that was closing in. It all began, as so many stories do in St. Mary Me, with something as seemingly harmless as a misplaced recipe. Mrs. Lathbury, still reeling from the disastrous garden party and its ill-fated turn of events, found herself desperately searching for the handwritten collection of baking notes that she kept with an almost sacred devotion. These were not just recipes. They were the very heart of her culinary world, each page carefully turned and cherished. Miss Marple, having arrived under the guise of sharing a jar of quince jelly, was drawn into the search with the quiet grace that was her trademark. Mrs. Lathbury insisted it had been misplaced somewhere in the pantry, that small dimly lit nook filled with the musty scent of long-forgotten jars and tins gathering the dust of years. It was there, amidst the forgotten preserves and the well-worn bottles of vinegar, that Miss Marple's fingers brushed against something unexpected. A bundle of old letters, tied together with a faded blue ribbon, their edges brittle and yellowed with age. Mrs. Lathbury, her voice suddenly too bright, dismissed them casually. "Oh, those," she said, as if they'd been of no more consequence than a misplaced spoon. But Miss Marple, who had never forgotten a single detail in her life, kept her silence. The weight of those letters, far more than mere paper and ink, seemed to settle in her hands, as if the secrets they held had waited far too long to be uncovered. That evening, as the letters unfolded upon her lap, Miss Marple allowed herself the rare indulgence of reading them slowly, each word meticulously absorbed. The handwriting was delicate, almost hesitant, but the story it told was one Miss Marple knew all too well from villages like St. Mary Me, an inheritance torn apart, a love quietly stolen, and a betrayal so subtle that it had barely disturbed the stillness of the air, yet left scars that had festered for decades. The tale was of a young woman, promised a future of love and legacy, only to have both denied in the wake of a sudden change in a will that favored another. Hearts shattered, reputations destroyed, and a life of potential happiness turned bitter. Miss Marple's fingers lingered on the final letter, her mind tracing the bitter legacy of that old quarrel. In villages like St. Mary Me, such things never truly died. They simply lay dormant, waiting for the right moment, or the wrong person, to bring them to the surface. The recipe book, when finally located, was tucked inside a biscuit tin, as though Mrs. Lathbury herself had been reluctant to acknowledge its presence, yet unable to rid herself of it entirely. Miss Marple, ever practical, flipped through its pages, her curiosity piqued by the seemingly innocuous collection of recipes: Victoria sponge, fruit scones, seed cake. But it was at the very bottom, under the heading for plum cake, that something caught her eye. A note written in a hand much firmer than Mrs. Lathbury's usual graceful script. It was a reminder about the timing of the final stir, a small detail that could easily have been overlooked, but one that changed the consistency of the batter in just the right way to conceal an additional ingredient. It was then, with a sudden sharp clarity, that Miss Marple realized this was no simple baking error. The note was not the work of a mere cook, but of someone with a precise understanding of chemistry, someone who knew exactly how to alter a recipe to hide a dangerous substance. The tingle of understanding that crept down Miss Marple's spine was unmistakable. This was no rash act of anger, or a spur-of-the-moment mistake. This had been planned with meticulous care, executed with the precision of a chemist, and the intent of someone who had thought through every detail. As the clock ticked softly in the background, Miss Marple sat in quiet contemplation, reviewing her mental list of those who might have been capable of such a crime. There were those who had motive, people who might have wished Mrs. Hartnell harm, but none of them possessed the calculated calm required to execute such a plan. There were others who could bake beautifully, yet knew nothing of poisons. And then, there was the rarest of combinations, the person who had both the motive and the expertise to make such a crime, both possible and nearly undetectable. And Miss Marple knew, without a doubt, that she was now standing on the precipice of a revelation far darker than any of the village's many secrets. The poison had not been an accident, and it had not been a crime born of sudden passion. It had been carefully plotted, with intent, and with the quiet precision of a mind that was as dangerous as it was meticulous. Mary Me had always been a village wrapped in the cozy, seemingly innocent glow of rural life, its cobbled streets and quaint cottages hiding whispers that could send a chill down even the most seasoned of souls. Beneath its peaceful facade, secrets festered, tangled in the roots of old trees, buried beneath rose bushes and stone walls, patiently waiting for the right moment to surface. This time, however, it wasn't just another trivial scandal. It was a betrayal so deep, so intricately woven into the fabric of the village, that when the truth emerged, it would shake the very foundation of St. Mary Me. It all began with Mrs. Lathbury's seemingly harmless recipe book, which she had misplaced, something ordinary enough for any housewife. But in this case, it was the key that unlocked a decades-old mystery. It had sat untouched for years, gathering dust in the forgotten corner of her pantry. But now, as fate would have it, it was the catalyst for something far darker. Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, had been invited under the pretense of sharing her renowned quince jelly. But her curiosity was piqued when she entered the house and found herself surrounded by the warm, familiar scent of homemade pies and the almost imperceptible tension that clung to the air. Something wasn't quite right. As they sat in Mrs. Lathbury's cozy kitchen, exchanging pleasantries and sipping tea, Miss Marple's gaze wandered across the room, as it often did, searching for the smallest clues that others might miss. Her eyes settled on the pantry door, slightly ajar, and a flicker of something caught her attention. She excused herself, her polite demeanor never changing, and moved toward the pantry, as if guided by an unseen force. Among the chaos of shelves stacked high with jars of preserves, canned vegetables, and dried herbs, Miss Marple's hand brushed against an old biscuit tin. Inside, tucked carefully between the pages of a faded recipe book, were letters, fragile and delicate, tied together with a ribbon that had long lost its luster. As she carefully unraveled the bundle, the sharp rustle of paper seemed to echo through the quiet room. Mrs. Lathbury's reaction was immediate, but she gave nothing away. A smile, perhaps too tight around the edges, and a hasty remark about misplaced recipes, but Miss Marple saw through it. The letters were more than just old correspondence. They spoke of something far more sinister, a history of broken promises and old grievances, stitched together by an inheritance that had caused the unraveling of lives. Miss Marple's fingers lingered over the delicate ink, the ink that now seemed more like blood on the page. The names mentioned within those letters weren't of ordinary people. They were of villagers whose lives had collided in ways that no one had dared to speak of. As Miss Marple turned the pages slowly, carefully, the pieces of the story fell into place. An engagement once celebrated had turned to dust, its vows shattered not by love's natural decline, but by the cold, calculating fingers of greed and scandal. A young man, once the pride of the village, had been accused of embezzling funds, and a woman had been left broken, her dreams of love and future dashed by accusations that had cut her to the bone. But that was not the end of it. There was something more, something darker hidden beneath the layers of this old, well-known story. The recipe book, which had once seemed a symbol of nostalgia and warmth, now felt like a relic of something much more dangerous. Inside the pages for the plum cake, a dessert that had once been a symbol of community and celebration, Miss Marple found a note, hastily scrawled in a hand unfamiliar to her. The writing was sharp, almost clinical, and it spoke of an ingredient added with a precision that chilled her to the core. Poison. Cyanide. The note was clear in its instructions, its careful mention of how it should be mixed into the sugar, its precise measurements. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't an outburst of anger. It was methodical, planned, cold. Someone had waited years to make their move, carefully nursing their anger, calculating the perfect moment to strike. And when they did so with the precision of a surgeon. Nothing was left to chance. The victim, however, was not who they intended. Mrs. Hartle, the woman at the center of this quiet storm, had been the target. But somewhere, somehow, a mistake had been made. They had killed the wrong person. As Miss Marple sat back in her chair, the weight of this realization pressed down on her, and she began to connect the dots in her mind. The villagers who had come and gone, the stories they'd shared, and the faces that had disappeared from her memory. There were too many secrets, too many untold truths that now swirled in the air like smoke. It wasn't just about who had wanted Mrs. Hartle dead, it was about who had been hiding in plain sight, weaving their web of deceit with care, and who had gotten tangled in their own plot. Mrs. Lathbury, with her too perfect manners and carefully curated image, was more than just a bystander in this drama. She was a part of it, a thread that ran deep through the village's history, connecting the past with the present, in ways that Miss Marple was only beginning to understand. The quiet village of St. Mary Me, where everyone knew everyone else's business, held within its walls the darkest of secrets. And Miss Marple knew that this mystery, this intricate puzzle, was far from over. The real culprit, the one who thought they had covered their tracks, was still out there, and as time passed, their carefully constructed facade would begin to crumble, revealing the truth buried beneath layers of lies. The game was only just beginning. Peggy's comment had barely settled into the air before Mrs. Phelps, her voice tinged with surprise, questioned how she could possibly know such a thing. Peggy's answer came too quickly, an offhand laugh, a half-formed excuse about reading it somewhere. But her cheeks flushed slightly, and her fingers twisted nervously at the sleeve of her cardigan. Miss Marple, who had been silent throughout the exchange, carefully set her teacup back onto its saucer, her expression as unreadable as ever, but her mind was already filing away the peculiar moment. As the conversation drifted back into more mundane topics, Miss Marple's thoughts did not waver. It was not Peggy's words that intrigued her, but the manner in which she had spoken them. The confidence, the ease, the familiarity with a topic not commonly discussed in polite circles. In the tight-knit world of St. Mary Me, knowledge of poisons was something people only learned through painful experience, or the kind of study that was rarely shared openly. The way Peggy had mentioned it suggested it wasn't an idle piece of gossip. It was something she knew intimately, perhaps from personal use, or from someone close to her. More troubling still, the specifics of the poison, the method of mixing it with sugar, were not public knowledge. That detail had never been printed in the papers, or mentioned in any gossip column, yet Peggy spoke of it with chilling nonchalance. Miss Marple's mind raced as she walked back to her cottage, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lanes. She kept her pace slow, her outward demeanor calm, but inside, she was already piecing together a puzzle. Peggy knew far more than she should have, and the knowledge was recent, too recent to have come from an old book or forgotten rumor. Miss Marple had lived long enough to recognize a carefully laid plan, one that required a patient hand, and she knew deep down that Peggy's involvement in this mystery was far from accidental. The following day, under the pretext of borrowing a recipe for lemon biscuits, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Lathbury once more. The kitchen was spotless, too spotless, and the recipe book, was nowhere to be found. Mrs. Lathbury's attempt at dismissing its absence was flimsy, a strained smile, and a careless wave of her hand, but Miss Marple saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. She had taken the book, or someone had. Later, while sipping tea at Mrs. Bantry's, Miss Marple gently steered the conversation toward baking. Soon, the floodgates opened, and the women began to reminisce about family recipes. Mrs. Bantry, who had known Mrs. Lathbury's family for years, casually mentioned that the plum cake recipe Mrs. Lathbury used had been passed down from her aunt. "I remember it well," Mrs. Bantry added with a knowing smile. "It calls for warming the brandy before adding it to the mix. Unusual, but Mrs. Lathbury swears by it." Miss Marple filed this away, her mind already racing ahead. Back home, she reconstructed the recipe, taking note of every step. But one small detail stood out. The original recipe called for the fruit to be folded in last, but Mrs. Lathbury's version incorporated the fruit earlier, mixed with the sugar. This seemingly small alteration was not a mistake. It was a deliberate choice, one that suggested the fruit was being hidden in the sugar, and what better way to hide a poison than to mask it in something so innocent, so easily overlooked. The fruit would dissolve seamlessly into the mixture, its deadly purpose concealed within the sweetness. Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. This wasn't just a case of a woman making a simple mistake. This was a planned and deliberate act of murder, and the cake had been the vehicle for it. The murderer was someone who had known exactly what they were doing. Someone who had patiently bided their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As she sat in her quiet cottage, Miss Marple knew the true nature of this mystery had only just begun to reveal itself, and it was darker and more twisted than she had initially thought. Miss Marple had long observed that the most misleading of appearances often hid the darkest of truths. As she strolled back from Mrs. Lathbury's, the soft hum of village life echoed around her, but her mind was far from idle. The missing recipe book had reappeared, of course, as such things often did, tucked away inconspicuously at the bottom of a box filled with forgotten papers. It wasn't just the sudden return of the book that unsettled her, but what lay between the yellowed pages of seemingly inconsequential documents. Among the mundane, a birth certificate caught her eye. Its ink faded, but its significance unmistakable. The name of the father, long erased, but still discernible, sent a chill through her. The mother's name, however, was the one that struck the hardest. It was the name of the very woman whose infamous plum cake had caused so much uproar in the village. The discovery wasn't just a revelation, it was a piece of a much larger puzzle that connected the dots of old family secrets and whispered scandals. This child, born out of wedlock, had remained hidden for years, but now, a single slip of paper threatened to expose everything. Miss Marple knew the village all too well. Murder here wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. It was always an act of desperation, often rooted in something buried deep in the past. A long-forgotten grievance, an unresolved conflict. She'd always known that what seemed like a tragic accident in the present was, in fact, the culmination of years of fear and buried shame. The poison had been carefully folded into the cake, the perfect means to eradicate a scandal, to hide the inconvenient truth of a secret child, who might inherit what some believed was their rightful legacy. But the wrong person had eaten the cake, and now the terrible truth was unraveling. As Miss Marple held the birth certificate in her hands, the weight of decades-old secrets pressed down on her. Her mind was already piecing together the people involved, the names, the motives, the fragile line between protecting a family's name and the lengths one would go to preserve that secrecy. It was all about control, the fear of losing it, and what people would do to keep the past from rising to the surface. There was something dangerous in the desperation of those with everything to lose, and Miss Marple knew that the true culprits were those who had hidden themselves behind well-crafted facades, terrified of their carefully curated lives falling apart. That night, she sat at home, knitting absent-mindedly, her mind whirling through possibilities. She could almost hear the ticking of the clock, the silence that stretched between the knowledge she had gathered, and the inevitable confrontation that would come. She needed to draw them all together, to set the stage for the final revelation. It would be soon, she knew, and the closer she got, the clearer it became. In a village like this, no secret remained buried forever. It always had a way of resurfacing, often in the most unexpected ways. Miss Marple's voice, soft yet laced with an undeniable clarity, filled the stillness of the room, its gentle cadence almost like the hum of a lullaby. As her knitting needles clicked together in a slow rhythmic beat, her words carried the weight of a lifetime spent observing human nature, where every glance, every gesture, and every word held significance. She looked at the gathered guests with the calm assurance of one who had seen through the veils of many such mysteries. "You see," she began, her voice lilting in the quiet evening, "the cake was never meant for Mrs. Harrel." A brief pause hung in the air, thickening the tension as her gaze flicked over to Mrs. Lathbury. "No, it was always meant for someone else entirely." The words fell with a soft impact, but their weight reverberated through the room. There was no theatrical flourish, no overt display of accusation, just the quiet unfolding of a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. Miss Marple continued, her hands moving gracefully with the knitting, never once faltering in her meticulous work. "It was Mrs. Lathbury, you see. The cake, the poison, it was meant for her." The revelation was almost casual in its delivery, but the truth hung like a fog, creeping into the corners of the room and settling into the minds of those present. The shock that rippled across the table was nearly imperceptible, but Miss Marple could feel it. She had been watching them all carefully, seeing how their eyes darted between one another, how their fingers twitched ever so slightly, betraying the tension they all tried so hard to mask. But Miss Marple was always the keenest observer, the one who could hear the unspoken words and see the unsaid truths. She leaned forward just slightly, her voice still soft, but now carrying the weight of years of experience, of a woman who had unraveled more than one twisted tale in her lifetime. "The motive, my dear friends, was not born from some petty jealousy or a personal grievance," she continued, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly as she spoke. "No, it was far more dangerous than that. The poison was not just meant to kill, it was meant to destroy, to erase, to bury the secrets that Mrs. Lathbury held, secrets that could have torn apart the very fabric of this village." The words, though spoken calmly, were charged with an undercurrent of inevitability. They were not just the whisper of a revelation, they were the quiet understanding of a woman who had seen the way things truly worked. She explained, piece by piece, how the innocent seeming swap of a plate, something so mundane, so easily overlooked, had set the entire tragedy in motion. It was a subtle maneuver, a moment that appeared harmless to everyone else, but to Miss Marple, it was the first thread pulled loose from the tightly wound fabric of deception. Her eyes flickered momentarily to Peggy Holmes, who shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and then to Mrs. Bantry, whose face had paled. They were all beginning to understand, slowly, the magnitude of the quiet calculation behind the act. The cyanide had been hidden so cleverly within the plum cake, disguised by a small but crucial detail that only the killer could have known. The very method of mixing the fruit with the sugar, a detail no one had mentioned before, not in the gossip, not in the whispers of the village. Only the person who had made the cake could have known it, and Miss Marple knew precisely who that person was. The room fell into a tense silence, thick with the unspoken truth. Miss Marple's gaze swept over her guests one last time, her face as serene as ever, her knitting still moving with an almost hypnotic precision. She had not accused Peggy Holmes directly, nor would she ever. Miss Marple never did. Her method was far more subtle. She didn't need to force a confession. No, she had simply set the stage for the guilty to see themselves in the mirror she had carefully crafted. Peggy, too eager to seem helpful, had inadvertently given herself away, and now the truth was laid bare, albeit in the quietest way possible. "Justice, my dear friends," Miss Marple said, her tone now carrying a weight that had not been there before, "is rarely about dramatic confrontations. It is about seeing the pattern beneath the surface. It is about noticing the stitch that was dropped long ago, the thread that connects the past to the present." Her hands, so steady and sure, continued their work, weaving the wool with the same precision that she had used to piece together this entire case. "And now that the pattern is complete," she added softly, her gaze fixed on the window, where the first stars began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, "all that remains is to tidy up the edges, as carefully as one folds the fruit into the cake at the very end." The guests, though they sat in stunned silence, were now fully aware of the delicate artistry of Miss Marple's mind. They had come to her table as visitors, but now they were the audience to her final performance, an unspoken truth woven into the fabric of their quiet village life, the gentle unspooling of a murder, not with accusation and confrontation, but with the same quiet patience and precision that Miss Marple applied to her knitting. The village would never be the same again. The truth, like the poison hidden in that cake, could no longer remain buried. It was now a part of the pattern, a part of the quiet, unspoken history of a place where nothing ever stayed forgotten for long. And as Miss Marple sat back in her chair, the room was filled with the soft clink of teacups, and the evening continued its peaceful eternal rhythm. But the truth, though wrapped in silence, was now an inescapable presence, woven through the very air they breathed. Miss Marple's words, spoken softly but with the precision of a seasoned observer, seemed to linger in the room, like the quiet buzz of a distant bee, unnoticed until its sting. "You see, it was never meant for Mrs. Hartnell," she said, her knitting needles clicking almost methodically, as if she were weaving a pattern as old as time itself. "It was always meant for Mrs. Lathbury, the keeper of the secrets, the gatekeeper of the past." The room, already thick with the weight of unspoken truths, seemed to still further as Miss Marple's gaze swept over the assembly of guests, each one holding their breath, waiting for the final twist in the tale. But fate, ever cruel, played its hand in the most unremarkable of ways. She continued, her voice barely above a whisper, yet every word sharp, like the needle she worked with. The wrong person had died. Mrs. Hartnell, sharp-tongued and gossipy, had taken the fatal slice of cake, not knowing that her politeness, her simple act of reaching for the wrong plate, had altered the course of a well-laid plan. It was a tragic error, an innocent mistake born from the kind of social niceties that in another life might have been charming. But Miss Marple knew better than anyone that murder, no matter how carefully planned, had no patience for politeness. She rested her fingers on the knitting, her movements never faltering, as she delved deeper into the tale. The poison had been placed in the cake, carefully, deliberately, with the intent to silence a past that had threatened the present. A secret, long buried, was meant to stay buried. But when Mrs. Hartnell, so accustomed to taking whatever she could, had reached for the wrong piece, it was her life that was snuffed out. Miss Marple's voice remained steady, yet there was a certain sadness in her words, the kind of sorrow that only those who had lived long enough to see history repeat itself could understand. "It is one thing," she said, her voice softening as she continued, "to plan the death of an enemy, to lay bare the calculations of years of hatred. But it is an entirely different thing to discover, too late, that you have killed the wrong person, the innocent one, the one who had done you no harm at all, the one whose only crime was having been in the wrong place at the wrong time." Her eyes, though calm and steady, spoke volumes, conveying a depth of understanding that was beyond the reach of those still too caught in their own webs of deceit. She had seen this before, in countless villages, countless lives, how hatred, once it took root, blossomed into a vengeance that in the end gave way to an irreversible tragedy. Human nature, she whispered to herself, as if reminding herself of a truth that never changed, never does change. The past, she knew, was always lurking beneath the surface, hidden away behind polite conversations and shallow smiles. But it was always there, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to uncover its ugly truths. And when it was uncovered, it never came alone. Letters long forgotten, old birth certificates stained by time, secrets altered, and recipes that held the keys to forgotten lives. These were the ingredients that had in the end led to murder. Not the work of a criminal mastermind, but of a frightened one, someone who feared the truth more than the consequences of their actions. "In a place like St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple said softly, her voice barely audible as she folded the napkin with slow, deliberate movements, "the past never stays buried. It lingers in the shadows, in the quiet corners of the rooms, in the way old friends avoid each other's gaze." She had seen it all before, and she knew it would happen again. When the village became restless with its own forgotten secrets, when the echoes of the past rang louder than the everyday hum of life. As she stood, gathering the last of the cups, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The village, for all its outward tranquility, had seen the very worst of human nature. It had seen the lies, the betrayals, the quiet malice that simmered beneath the veneer of civility. Yet even as Miss Marple tidied the tea things with practiced ease, her mind could not help but wander to the inevitability of it all. The simple truth that, in villages like St. Mary Mead, the greatest crime of all was forgetting. She stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing her face as she took a moment to gaze at the village, peaceful now as night fell. It was so deceptively calm, the streetlights casting their gentle glow, the hum of radios in the windows, the quiet rhythm of life going on as if nothing had changed. But Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the peace, beneath the calm, lay a simmering pot of human emotions, envy, fear, pride, resentment, all the ingredients for another tragedy. And though she had solved this case, she knew that the village would never forget. It would never truly forget, because in St. Mary Mead, the past was always at the table. And one day, when the next tragedy came, the village would find itself sitting down once more to a meal of secrets, with the poison already in the cake, and the truth hidden just beneath the icing. With her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, Miss Marple turned toward her cottage, leaving the village to its whispers, its secrets, and its inevitable future. Mary Mead, the village that appears so serenely tucked away from the world, the true chaos often bubbles just beneath the surface, hidden in the folds of everyday life. Every neatly trimmed hedge, every innocent conversation over tea, holds within it the slow burn of jealousy, the echo of old wounds that refuse to heal, and the constant quiet march of time that ensures the past is never fully forgotten. Here, the smallest of actions, a plate that is swapped in haste, a recipe that has been subtly altered, a letter shoved into a forgotten corner, can send ripples through the very fabric of the community, unraveling lives in ways no one could ever predict. Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, had always known this truth. Beneath the polite smiles and the friendly gossip, there were tangled webs of old grudges, unspoken fears, and secrets long buried, refusing to remain forgotten. The village may have looked untouched by time, but its heart was a place where nothing truly stayed hidden forever. And therein lies the question that haunts every soul who calls St. Mary Mead home. If you lived here, in a place where everyone knows everyone's secrets, could you truly trust your neighbors? Or would you, like so many before, lock your own secrets away, never to be spoken of again? A place like this forces you to ask yourself whether the truth once unearthed is ever worth the cost. Would you risk your own peace, your safety to expose what lies beneath? Or would you rather live a life of quiet, controlled lies, burying your past so deeply that it might never resurface, until of course it does? The twists in this case, like the very nature of the village itself, were unexpected, hiding in plain sight all along. The poisoner had walked among them, unnoticed, like so many before her. Did you, dear reader, suspect her? Or was the reveal as much of a shock to you as it was to those who lived here? Share your thoughts with us. What would you do if faced with the same question in your own life? How would you navigate a village where secrets were currency, and everyone was hiding something? And as always, if you enjoyed unraveling this mystery with us, don't forget to subscribe for more stories where every quiet moment might hold the key to a murder, and the truth always seems just one step away, waiting to be uncovered, piece by piece. Share this video with anyone you know who thrives on the subtle twists and turns of a good mystery. After all, there's nothing quite like solving a mystery together.